The summer of 1978 was magic in Hollywood. Disco music filled the air, people danced under mirror balls, and movie theaters were packed every weekend. In the middle of all this glitter and glamour lived a woman named Elena Hartley. She was 32 years old, and everyone said she had finally made it big. Elena wasn't born into fame. She grew up in a tiny town in Montana, where everybody knew everybody else's business. Her father worked at the local hardware store, and her mother taught piano lessons in their living room. Elena was the kind of girl who dreamed bigger than her small town could hold. She'd watch old movies on their black and white television set and tell anyone who'd listen that someday she'd be up there on that screen. When Elena turned 18, she packed one suitcase and bought a bus ticket to Los Angeles. Her parents cried at the station, begging her to at least finish college first. But Elena had made up her mind. She kissed them goodbye and promised to write every week. That bus ride took 3 days, and Elena barely slept. She was too excited, too nervous, too alive with possibility. The first few years in Hollywood were rough. Really rough. Elena worked as a waitress at a diner on Sunset Boulevard. She'd serve coffee to producers and directors, always hoping someone would notice her. She went to hundreds of auditions. Sometimes she'd get called back. Mostly she'd hear nothing at all. She lived in a cramped apartment with 3 other girls who were all chasing the same dream. They'd practice their lines together, do each other's makeup, and share whatever food they had. But Elena had something special. People noticed it even when she was just bringing them scrambled eggs and toast. She had these incredible green eyes that seemed to look right through you. When she smiled, the whole room felt warmer. And when she acted, even in those early terrible plays in tiny theaters, something magical happened. You couldn't look away from her. In 1975, after 7 years of struggle, Elena got her first real movie role. It wasn't the lead, but it was enough. She played the best friend of the main character, and she had maybe 15 minutes of screen time. But those 15 minutes changed everything. People left theaters talking about her. Critics mentioned her in reviews. Suddenly, casting directors knew her name. The next 3 years became a whirlwind. Elena landed bigger roles, better parts. She moved from that cramped apartment into a beautiful Spanish-style house in the Hollywood Hills. The house had white stucco walls, red tile roofs, and a garden full of roses. She'd stand on her balcony at night, looking down at the city lights, hardly believing this was her life now. By 1978, Elena had just finished filming what everyone said would be her masterpiece. It was a drama about a woman trying to escape her past, and the role fit Elena like a glove. The director told her she was going to win awards. Her agent said this would make her a household name. Magazine photographers wanted her picture. Talk show hosts wanted her on their couches. Fashion designers sent her free clothes, hoping she'd wear them to premieres. But something was changing inside Elena. The more famous she became, the more trapped she felt. She started having trouble sleeping. She'd lie awake in her beautiful house, listening to every little sound. Sometimes she felt like someone was watching her, though she could never prove it. Her friends noticed she seemed jumpy, distracted. At parties, she'd disappear early. On set, she'd ask if anyone had seen a strange man hanging around. Elena had recently divorced her husband, a screenwriter named Thomas Chen. They'd been married for 4 years, and it ended badly. Thomas told friends that Elena had become impossible to live with. She was paranoid, he said. She accused him of following her, of checking up on her. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced someone was in the house. Thomas loved her, but he couldn't handle it anymore. The divorce was finalized in June of 1978. Her agent, a sharp woman named Beverly Goldstein, worried about Elena constantly. Beverly had been in this business for 20 years and had seen plenty of young stars burn out. She'd call Elena every morning to check on her. She'd send her assistant to Elena's house with groceries and magazines just to make sure she was eating and taking care of herself. Beverly kept telling Elena to see a doctor, maybe talk to someone. But Elena always brushed it off with that famous smile and said she was fine. The truth was, Elena wasn't fine. She'd been receiving strange letters for months. They came to her house, to the studio, even to Beverly's office. The letters weren't threatening exactly, but they were intense. Someone wrote about watching her movies over and over, about feeling connected to her, about knowing her better than anyone else could. The letters talked about how beautiful she looked in certain scenes, what she'd worn to certain events. details that showed someone was paying very close attention. Elena took the letters to the police in July. The officer who took her statement was polite but not particularly concerned. He said lots of famous people got fan mail. Unless there was a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested she get better security for her house, maybe hire a bodyguard. Elena left the police station feeling more alone than ever. In late August, Elena finished her final scenes for the new movie. The wrap party was at a fancy restaurant in Beverly Hills. Everyone was celebrating, drinking champagne, making toasts. Elena smiled and laughed and posed for pictures. But Beverly noticed she kept glancing at the door, kept checking over her shoulder. When Beverly asked if everything was okay, Elena squeezed her hand and said she just needed a break. On September 5, 1978, Elena called Beverly from her house. She said she needed some time away from everything. Just a few weeks to clear her head, maybe visit her parents in Montana. Beverly understood. The movie wouldn't premiere until December, so Elena had time. They agreed Elena would call in 2 weeks to discuss the publicity schedule for the film's release. That was the last conversation anyone ever had with Elena Hartley. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Beverly called Elena's house dozens of times. No answer. She drove to the Hollywood Hills villa and knocked on the door. Nothing. She called Elena's parents in Montana. They hadn't heard from their daughter either, and now they were worried too. Something was very, very wrong. And what nobody knew yet was that the answer to Elena's disappearance was hiding right there, sealed behind the walls of her own home, waiting 40 years to be found. Beverly Goldstein didn't sleep much that third week. She kept picking up the phone, dialing Elena's number and letting it ring 20, 30 times. Each time the same empty silence. On September 26th, she finally called the police. The officer who took the missing persons report was named Detective Frank Morrison. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. He listened to Beverly describe everything. The phone call, the silence, the unanswered door. He wrote it all down in his notebook with careful, neat handwriting. "Has Miss Hartley ever done this before?" Detective Morrison asked. "Just disappeared without telling anyone?" Beverly thought about it. "No, never. She's always been professional. Always shown up when she said she would." The detective nodded. "What about her state of mind? Was she depressed? Anxious?" Beverly hesitated. She didn't want to make Elena sound unstable, but she had to be honest. She'd been stressed lately. The divorce was hard on her, and she felt like someone was watching her, following her around. Detective Morrison's pen stopped moving. "Did she report this to the police?" "Yes, back in July, but they said there wasn't much they could do without a direct threat." The detective made another note. Then he asked Beverly to meet him at Elena's house the next morning. They needed to look inside. When they arrived at the Spanish villa, everything looked normal from the outside. The roses in the garden were blooming. The morning sun made the white walls glow. Beverly used the spare key Elena had given her years ago. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door. Inside, the house was neat. Too neat, almost. The kitchen was spotless. Dishes washed and put away. The living room looked like a magazine photo. But something felt wrong. It felt empty in a way that went beyond just nobody being home. Detective Morrison walked through each room slowly. In Elena's bedroom, the bed was made perfectly. The closet was full of expensive dresses and shoes. Her jewelry box sat on the dresser, still containing thousands of dollars worth of necklaces and rings. If Elena had planned to leave, she hadn't taken much with her. On the nightstand, Morrison found Elena's address book. He flipped through it, seeing names of actors, directors, restaurant owners. On the bathroom counter sat her makeup and perfume bottles. Her toothbrush was still in its holder, but her purse was gone. And in the closet, there was a gap on the shelf where a suitcase might have been. "Looks like she packed and left," Morrison said. "Took her purse, probably some clothes." Beverly wanted to believe that, but it didn't feel right. "She would have called me," she insisted. Even if she needed space, she would have checked in by now. They searched the rest of the house. In a desk drawer, Detective Morrison found the letters. The strange fan mail Elena had mentioned. He read through them, his expression growing darker with each one. The letters were obsessive, talking about destiny and connection and fate. They were signed only with the letter R. The next day, a patrol officer found Elena's car. It was parked at Los Angeles International Airport in the long-term lot. The discovery changed everything. Suddenly, it looked like Elena had planned this, like she'd driven to the airport and caught a flight somewhere far away. Detective Morrison checked with the airlines. No one named Elena Hartley had boarded any flights that week. But she could have used a fake name. She could have bought a ticket with cash. In 1978, airport security wasn't like it is today. You didn't need to show much identification. If Elena wanted to disappear, the airport would have been the perfect starting point. The media grabbed hold of the story within days. Newspapers ran headlines like "Hollywood Star Vanishes" and "Actress Missing After Mysterious Phone Call." Television news programs showed clips from Elena's movies. Reporters camped outside her house hoping for any scrap of new information. Elena's ex-husband, Thomas, gave an interview to a major newspaper. He sat in his apartment looking tired and sad, telling the reporter about their marriage. Elena was troubled, he said carefully. She had anxiety. Sometimes she'd talk about wanting to just disappear, start over somewhere new where nobody knew who she was. When Beverly read that interview, she was furious. She called Thomas and yelled at him for making Elena sound crazy. But Thomas defended himself. He said he was just being honest. He said people deserved to know that Elena had been struggling. Elena's parents drove down from Montana. Her father looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Her mother could barely speak without crying. They begged anyone watching the news to help find their daughter. They said Elena would never just leave without saying goodbye. They knew their girl. This wasn't like her. The police investigation continued for months. Detective Morrison interviewed dozens of people. He talked to everyone who'd worked on Elena's last movie. He spoke with the director, the other actors, the camera crew. Everyone said the same thing. Elena had seemed distracted lately, but she'd been professional. Nobody had seen anything suspicious. Morrison tracked down the author of those obsessive letters. It took weeks of work, tracing postmarks and handwriting. Finally, he found him, a man named Raymond Walsh who worked as a carpenter. He'd done some renovation work on houses all over Los Angeles, including some in the Hollywood Hills. When Morrison showed up at Raymond's apartment, he found a place that was almost scary in its obsession. The walls were covered with pictures of Elena cut from magazines. Newspaper articles about her were taped everywhere. Movie posters filled every available space. It was like a shrine, but Raymond had an alibi. He'd been working on a construction job in San Diego the week Elena disappeared. His boss confirmed it. Other workers remembered seeing him there every day. The timeline didn't match up. Still, Morrison kept Raymond on his radar. Something about the man made his detective instincts scream. The way Raymond talked about Elena like he knew her personally, like they had some special connection. But without evidence, Morrison couldn't do anything. As 1978 turned into 1979, the investigation went cold. Elena's movie premiered in December without her. Critics loved her performance. She was nominated for awards she'd never be there to accept. Her face appeared on magazine covers with words like tragic and mysterious beneath it. Beverly kept Elena's house exactly as it was, paying the bills out of Elena's bank account. She kept hoping that one day Elena would come back, that there would be some explanation that made sense. But deep in her heart, Beverly knew something terrible had happened. She just didn't know what. None of them did. And the answer was waiting, locked away in darkness just a few feet below where they'd all been standing, behind a wall that looked like every other wall in that beautiful Spanish villa. Time passed. The world moved on. But Elena's secret remained, patient and still, waiting to be discovered. 20 years passed. Then 30. Then 40. The world changed in ways nobody in 1978 could have imagined. Disco died and came back as a nostalgia trend. Cassette tapes gave way to CDs, then to downloads, then to streaming. The Berlin Wall fell. The internet arrived. Smartphones became something everyone carried in their pockets. Hollywood itself transformed completely. But Elena Hartley's story remained frozen in time. Unsolved. Unexplained. Just another Hollywood mystery that people talked about late at night. Her movies became cult classics. Film students studied her performances. People who weren't even born when she disappeared would discover her films and fall in love with those incredible green eyes. That mysterious smile. Online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries always had threads about her. What happened to Elena Hartley? Where did she go? Some people believed she'd run away to Europe and was living under a new name. Others thought she'd been murdered by an obsessed fan. A few insisted she'd joined a religious commune and had chosen to leave her old life behind. Everyone had a theory. Nobody had proof. Detective Frank Morrison retired in 1995. He was 70 years old and his knees hurt, and he was tired of seeing crimes he couldn't solve. But Elena's case haunted him until the day he died in 2003. His daughter found boxes of files in his garage after the funeral. Notes, photos, interviews. Her father had never stopped working on it, even after he'd turned in his badge. Beverly Goldstein had passed away in 2012 at the age of 86. She'd kept representing actors right up until the end, discovering new talent and making careers happen, but she never stopped paying the bills on Elena's house, even when it made no financial sense. Even when her own children begged her to let it go, the house stayed locked and empty, a time capsule of 1978. Elena's parents both died in the early 90s, never knowing what happened to their daughter. That was perhaps the saddest part of the whole story. They'd gone to their graves with that terrible question mark hanging over them. The house changed hands after Beverly died. Her estate sold it to an investor who didn't care about its history. He rented it out to a series of tenants who never stayed long. People said it felt strange living there. Not haunted exactly, but heavy. Like the walls themselves were sad. By 2019, the house had been empty for 3 years. The Spanish tiles were cracked. The roses had grown wild and tangled. The white stucco walls were stained and peeling. It sat there on its hill overlooking Los Angeles, slowly falling apart. That's when a development company called Pacific Heights Properties bought it. They had plans, big plans. They were going to tear down the old villa and build luxury condominiums, 4 units, each selling for over $2 million. Location, location, location. The view of the city was worth a fortune. The company hired a construction crew to start the renovation work. They wanted to see what was salvageable before they demolished everything. Maybe some of the original tiles could be cleaned and reused. Maybe the wooden beams were still solid. The crew chief was a man named Vincent Rodriguez. He'd been in construction for 30 years and had worked on everything from shopping malls to movie studios. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. Vincent didn't know much about Elena Hartley. He was too young to remember 1978, and old Hollywood mysteries weren't really his thing. On a Tuesday morning in October, Vincent and his crew started working in the basement. Most houses in the Hollywood Hills didn't have basements, but this one did. It was damp and dark and smelled like mold. The walls were covered in old plaster that crumbled when you touched it. Vincent was checking the foundation walls, tapping them with a hammer to find the studs behind the plaster. That's when he noticed something odd. One section of wall sounded different, hollow, like there was empty space behind it. He called over his assistant, a young guy named Danny Patel. "Listen to this," Vincent said, and tapped the wall again. Then he moved 3 feet to the left and tapped again. The sound was completely different. Danny frowned. "That's weird. Maybe there's a pipe back there or something?" Vincent shook his head. "No, this sounds bigger than a pipe. Sounds like a space. They brought in better tools." Vincent carefully chipped away at the plaster, following the seam where the hollow sound was loudest. The plaster was old and came away in chunks. Behind it was brick, but the brick looked newer than the rest of the basement. Different color, different style. This was added later, Vincent said. This isn't original construction. It took them 2 hours to break through the brick wall. They worked carefully, not sure what they'd find. Maybe it was just an old storage space that had been sealed up. Maybe someone had closed off part of the basement to save on heating costs. When the hole was finally big enough, Vincent shined his flashlight through. What he saw made his blood run cold. It was a room. A small room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. There was a cot against one wall, covered in a rotting blanket. Empty tin cans were scattered on the floor, and on a small table sat a stack of notebooks, their covers faded and warped from moisture. "Oh my God," Danny whispered behind him. "What is this?" Vincent didn't answer. He was staring at the walls of the hidden room. They were covered in scratches, deep gouges in the plaster, like someone had clawed at them with their fingernails trying to get out. Vincent climbed through the hole, his heart pounding. The air inside the room was stale and dead. He picked up one of the notebooks with shaking hands and opened it. The handwriting inside was small and desperate. The first page had a date. September 7th, 1978, and it had a name. Elena Hartley. Vincent dropped the notebook like it had burned him. He knew that name. Everyone in Los Angeles knew that name. The actress who disappeared. The unsolved mystery. The legend. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His voice shook as he spoke to the operator. "I need to report something. I'm at 4157 Hillcrest Drive in the Hollywood Hills. We just found a hidden room in a basement, and I think it has something to do with Elena Hartley, the actress from the 70s who disappeared." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the operator said, "Sir, please stay where you are. Don't touch anything else. We're sending police right away." Vincent climbed back out of the hole and sat down on the basement floor. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Danny stood near the stairs looking pale. Neither of them spoke. 41 years. That's how long Elena's secret had been waiting behind that wall. 41 years of darkness and silence, of questions without answers, of a family that died not knowing. And now, finally, the truth was about to come out. The police arrived within 15 minutes. Then more police, then detectives, then crime scene investigators in white suits carrying equipment. Within an hour, the quiet street was filled with patrol cars, their lights flashing red and blue against the old Spanish villa. Detective Laura Chen was assigned to the case. She was 42 years old and had been with the LAPD for 20 years. She'd heard about Elena Hartley, of course. Every detective in Los Angeles knew the story. It was one of those legendary cold cases that older cops talked about in break rooms. Laura stood in the basement looking at the hole in the wall. She'd seen a lot of disturbing things in her career, but this hit differently. The scratches on the walls inside that hidden room. The desperate gouges in the plaster. Someone had been trapped in there. Someone had suffered. "We need to process everything carefully," she told her team. "This is a crime scene that's 41 years old. We need to treat it like it just happened." The forensic team set up lights and cameras. They photographed everything from every angle. They carefully collected the tin cans, the rotting blanket, the notebooks. Each item was labeled and sealed in evidence bags. Laura put on gloves and picked up one of the notebooks. She found a corner away from the chaos and started reading. What she found in those pages made her stomach turn. Elena's handwriting started neat and controlled. The early entries were dated September 1978. She described what had happened, how she'd been preparing to leave for Montana to visit her parents, how she'd heard a knock at her door that evening. When she'd opened it, Raymond Walsh had been standing there with a clipboard, saying he needed to check some work he'd done on her house months before. Elena had let him in. Why wouldn't she? He'd worked on her home before. He seemed harmless, but Raymond wasn't harmless. Once inside, he'd grabbed her from behind and covered her mouth with a cloth soaked in something chemical. Elena wrote about waking up in the dark, her head pounding, not knowing where she was. When she'd screamed, nobody heard. She was already in the hidden room Raymond had built months earlier, during those renovations. The notebooks detailed everything that followed. Raymond brought her food and water every day. He talked to her for hours, telling her about how they were meant to be together, how he'd been watching her for 2 years, how he'd built this room just for her, where they could be alone, away from the world that didn't understand their connection. Elena wrote about trying to reason with him, about begging him to let her go, about promising she wouldn't tell anyone. But Raymond lived in his own reality. He told her that eventually she'd understand, that she'd see they were destined to be together. He said the outside world had corrupted her, but here in this room she could become her true self. As Laura read, she felt tears forming in her eyes. Elena's entries showed her fear, her desperation, her attempts to stay sane. She wrote about memories of her childhood in Montana, about her parents, about the roles she'd played in movies. She wrote about counting the days, trying to keep track of time in a room with no windows. Elena had tried to escape multiple times. She wrote about each attempt. Once, she'd pretended to be sick, hoping Raymond would take her to a hospital. He'd just brought her medicine and told her to rest. Another time, she'd tried to rush past him when he opened the door. He was stronger than he looked. He'd pushed her back and didn't bring her food for 2 days as punishment. The entries continued through October, November, December. By Christmas of 1978, Elena's handwriting had started to change. It was shakier, less controlled. She wrote about losing hope, about wondering if anyone was looking for her. about the terrible thought that maybe people had stopped searching, that they'd assumed she'd run away. But then something in the entries shifted. Around February of 1979, Elena started writing about a plan. She'd been watching Raymond carefully, studying his patterns. He always carried keys on his belt. He always stood in the same spot when he brought her meals. And he'd started to trust her more, started to think she was accepting their situation. Elena wrote that she had to try one more time. She couldn't live like this. She wrote about collecting a piece of broken metal from one of the tin cans, about hiding it under her mattress, about waiting for the right moment. The final entries were from early March 1979. Elena's handwriting was barely readable, shaking across the page. She described her plan in detail. When Raymond brought her dinner, she would pretend to have something important to tell him. Something he'd want to hear. She'd get him to sit on the cot next to her. Then she'd use the sharp metal piece. She'd aim for his side, somewhere that would hurt him badly enough that she could get past him and run. The last entry was dated March 15, 1979. It was just a few sentences. Today is the day. I can't wait any longer. Either I get out of here or I die trying. If someone ever finds this, please tell my parents I love them. Tell them I fought. Tell them I never stopped fighting. That's where the notebooks ended. No more entries. No description of what happened next. Laura closed the notebook and sat in silence for a moment. Around her, the forensic team continued their work. But she needed a minute to process what she'd just read. The next step was clear. They needed to find out everything they could about Raymond Walsh. What had happened to him in March of 1979? Where had he gone? And most importantly, where was Elena? Laura's partner, Detective James Park, had already started running background checks. He came down to the basement carrying a laptop. I found him, he said. Raymond Walsh died March 28, 1979 in a hospital in Henderson, Nevada. That's just outside Las Vegas. What did he die from? Laura asked. James clicked through the records. Severe internal injuries. Complications from trauma. He checked in on March 16th, the day after Elena's last journal entry. Paid cash, gave a fake name, but they got his real identity when he died. His fingerprints were in the system because he'd been arrested once for stalking back in 1976. Laura felt her pulse quicken. March 16th, so Elena actually did it. She fought back. She hurt him badly enough that he needed a hospital. Looks that way, James agreed. But if Elena injured him and got out of that room, where did she go? Why didn't she come forward? Why didn't anyone find her? James shook his head. I don't know, but there's something else. Before Raymond died, a nurse wrote in the chart that he kept muttering strange things. About letting someone go. About the desert. About how sorry he was. Laura and James looked at each other. The desert. Nevada. Las Vegas was surrounded by hundreds of miles of empty desert. We need to get to Nevada, Laura said quietly. We need to find out exactly where Raymond went before he checked into that hospital. Because I think Elena made it out of that room, but I don't think she made it home. The investigation was about to enter its final heartbreaking chapter. After 41 years, Elena Hartley's story was finally going to end. Not the way anyone had hoped. But at least it would end with truth. Detective Laura Chen and her team flew to Las Vegas 2 days after discovering the hidden room. They brought copies of Raymond Walsh's hospital records, Elena's journals, and 41 years' worth of questions that needed answers. The hospital where Raymond had died was still standing. Though it had been renovated several times, Laura met with the administration, explaining why she needed access to old records. The hospital's legal team was cooperative. This wasn't just any cold case. This was Elena Hartley. The record showed that Raymond had checked in on March 16, 1979 at 3 a.m. He'd been barely conscious, bleeding internally from what the doctors described as a stab wound to his abdomen. He'd registered under the name Robert Watson and paid cash for treatment. The emergency room staff had tried to save him, but the damage was too severe. He'd developed an infection. His organs had started failing. By March 28th, he was gone. But it was the nurse's notes that interested Laura most. A woman named Patricia Green had been working the night shift when Raymond was admitted. She'd written detailed observations about his condition, including the strange things he'd said while semi-conscious. Laura tracked down Patricia Green. She was retired now, living in a quiet neighborhood in Las Vegas. She was 78 years old with white hair and kind eyes. When Laura explained why she was there, Patricia invited her inside immediately. "I remember him," Patricia said, settling into her armchair. "You don't forget patients like that. He was in so much pain, but he kept talking, kept saying he'd made a terrible mistake." "What exactly did he say?" Laura asked, her pen ready. Patricia closed her eyes, reaching back through the decades. "He said something like, 'I let her go. I had to let her go.' And then he mentioned the desert. He said, 'She's in the desert now, and I'm sorry, I'm so sorry.' At the time, I thought he was just delirious from the fever and the pain. People say strange things when they're dying. Did he say anything about where in the desert?" Patricia nodded slowly. "He mentioned a place, Red Rock. He said past Red Rock where the road ends. I remember because I grew up near Red Rock Canyon. It's beautiful out there." Laura felt her heart racing. Red Rock Canyon was just west of Las Vegas, miles and miles of desert landscape. If Elena had made it out of that basement room, if she'd fought Raymond and escaped, what had happened next? The pieces started coming together in Laura's mind. Elena had attacked Raymond in that hidden room. She'd hurt him badly, but he must have been strong enough to fight back, to hurt her too. Maybe in the struggle they'd both been injured. Raymond had managed to get away, to drive to Nevada. But what about Elena? Laura's team expanded the search. They brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment and search dogs trained to detect human remains. They got permission to search the areas around Red Rock Canyon, focusing on places where the paved roads ended and dirt roads began. It took 6 days of searching. 6 long days under the hot Nevada sun, covering miles of rocky terrain. The team was beginning to lose hope. The desert was vast. 41 years was a long time. Wind and weather could have buried or moved anything that might have been there. Then, on the 7th day, one of the search dogs signaled near an old desert wash, about 12 miles past the main Red Rock Visitor Center. The area was remote, accessible only by a rough dirt road that barely existed anymore. The forensic team carefully excavated the site. 3 feet down, they found her. Elena Hartley's remains were wrapped in an old blanket buried in a shallow grave. The forensic anthropologist confirmed it was her through dental records. She'd been 32 years old when she died. In her prime. With her whole life still ahead of her, the autopsy revealed what had happened in those final moments. Elena had injuries consistent with a violent struggle. She'd successfully stabbed Raymond with that piece of metal she'd hidden, just like she'd written in her journal, but he'd fought back. In the chaos of that fight, they'd both been mortally wounded. The forensic evidence painted a grim picture. Raymond, bleeding and panicking, had somehow gotten Elena into his truck. Maybe he thought he could save her. Maybe he thought he could hide what he'd done. He'd driven east away from Los Angeles, heading toward Nevada where he had family. But Elena had died during that drive, probably within an hour of leaving the house. Desperate and dying himself, Raymond had pulled off the road past Red Rock Canyon. He'd buried Elena in the desert, using the last of his strength. Then he'd driven to the hospital knowing he was dying too. That's why he'd muttered those things to the nurse. The guilt. The horror of what he'd done. Even in his twisted mind, he'd known it had all gone terribly wrong. The news of Elena's discovery spread around the world within hours. Every major news outlet covered the story. The actress who'd vanished in 1978 had finally been found. Her 41-year mystery had been solved. But for Laura Chen, the hardest part came next. Elena's parents were gone, but she had a younger brother who was still alive. His name was Daniel, and he was 68 years old, living in Montana. Laura had to call him and tell him that his sister had been found. Daniel cried on the phone. He said he'd always hoped Elena had run away and was living a happy life somewhere under a different name. That hope had kept him going for 4 decades. Learning the truth was devastating, but he also said something Laura would never forget. "At least now we know," Daniel said through his tears. "At least now she can come home." Elena's remains were transported back to Montana. Daniel arranged for her to be buried next to their parents in the small cemetery overlooking the valley where she'd grown up. The funeral was private, just Daniel and a few family members. But outside the cemetery gates, hundreds of people gathered. Fans who'd loved her movies. People who'd followed her story for decades. They brought flowers and photographs and handwritten notes. The Spanish villa in the Hollywood Hills was preserved after the discovery. Pacific Heights Properties donated the property to the city. It became a museum dedicated to Elena's memory, but also to all the victims of violence whose stories go untold. The hidden room in the basement was sealed behind glass, a reminder of what she'd endured. Vincent Rodriguez, the construction foreman who discovered the room, attended the museum's opening. He stood in front of a photograph of Elena from 1978, that beautiful smile, those incredible green eyes. "I'm glad we found her," he said quietly. "I'm glad we could bring her home." Elena's movies experienced a resurgence. A new generation discovered her talent, her grace, her undeniable screen presence. But now when people watched her performances, they watched them differently. They saw a woman who'd fought until her last breath. A woman who'd refused to give up, even in the darkest circumstances. Her final journal entry was framed and displayed in the museum. "Tell them I fought. Tell them I never stopped fighting." And now everyone knew. Elena Hartley hadn't run away from fame. She hadn't abandoned her family or her career. She'd been stolen from the world by a man who couldn't accept that she wasn't his, and she'd fought back with everything she had. 41 years was a long time to wait for the truth. But the truth, when it finally came, brought a kind of peace. Not the happy ending anyone wanted, but closure, understanding, and the knowledge that Elena Hartley's story, tragic as it was, had finally been told. Her grave in Montana has fresh flowers on it every week. Sometimes from Daniel, sometimes from strangers who never met her but felt connected to her story. The headstone is simple. It has her name, her dates, and one line underneath. She never stopped fighting. And she didn't. Until the very end, Elena Hartley fought for her life, for her freedom, for her chance to go home. That's how she should be remembered. Not as a mystery or a tragedy, but as a fighter. As a survivor who almost made it. As a woman who deserved so much more than what she got. The world lost something special when it lost Elena Hartley. But at least now, finally, she could rest.